The air inside the municipal auditorium was thick, stagnant, and smelling faintly of sweat and liniment oil. It was August 2, 1964 in Long Beach, California, a date that would eventually be carved into the bedrock of combat history, though nobody in the cheap seats knew it yet. The International Karate Championships were underway, hosted by the legendary Ed Parker. The room was packed with the hardest men on the planet, heavyweight black belts, grandmasters of traditional karate, and street-hardened brawlers who believed that fighting was a game of mass, bone density, and brute force. In this ecosystem of giants, a 23-year-old man stepped onto the mat. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed scarcely 135 pounds. With the Titan standing with arms crossed on the sidelines, he looked like a gust of wind could knock him over. One champion, a man who had spent decades conditioning his knuckles against wood and stone, looked at the slight figure and reportedly muttered the sentiment that was on everyone's mind: "You are too small." That man was Bruce Lee, and he wasn't there to compete for a trophy. He was there to dismantle the laws of physics as the martial arts world understood them. The atmosphere was skeptical, bordering on hostile. In the mid-1960s, martial arts were strictly segregated by style and weight. If you were small, you were expected to lose to the big man. It was a simple equation of mass times acceleration. But the crowd watching Bruce Lee that day did not understand that he had rewritten the equation. He wasn't relying on mass. He was relying on a terrifying, almost inhuman maximization of acceleration. The challenger, a highly decorated karate practitioner, stepped forward to participate in a demonstration that was supposed to put this young upstart in his place. The premise was simple. The champion would stand ready, hands up, fully prepared to block. Lee would stand just a few feet away. Lee told him exactly what was going to happen. He was going to punch him in the face, and there was nothing the champion could do about it. The tension in the room shifted from dismissal to curiosity. The champion planted his feet, digging his heels into the mat, locking his focus on Lee's eyes. This was a man trained to react, a man whose reflexes were honed in thousands of sparring matches. He knew the punch was coming. He knew the target. In the timeline of human reaction, he held all the cards, but when the moment broke, time seemed to glitch. Bruce Lee moved. It wasn't a telegraphed swing or a wind-up. It was an explosion of kinetic energy that originated from the floor, traveled through the hips, and snapped at the end of the fist. Before the champion's brain could even process the visual signal that Lee had moved, the fist had already stopped, hovering millimeters from his nose, and retracted back to the hip. The crowd gasped, but the champion insisted he wasn't ready. He claimed he had blinked. He asked for another go. Lee smiled, a confident, almost wolfish grin that would later become famous in cinemas worldwide. He nodded. The champion reset, adrenaline now flooding his system, eyes wide, muscles coiled like steel cables. He was determined not just to block, but to prove that size and tradition still held the throne. 7 seconds later, the demonstration was over, but the lesson would last a lifetime. Lee struck again, and again, and again. Each time, the champion's hands flinched, jerking toward a defense that was woefully late. It was a display of speed that bordered on the supernatural. Lee wasn't just faster, he was operating in a different temporal reality. To understand how a 135-pound man could humiliate a prepared karate champion, you have to look beyond the mysticism and into the biology. The average human reaction time to a visual stimulus is roughly 0.25 seconds. For a trained fighter, it might be 0.2 seconds. Bruce Lee's punching speed was clocked at around 0.05 of a second from a distance of 3 feet. He was moving 4 times faster than the champion's brain could send the electrical signal to his arms to block. This was the moment the too small argument died a violent death. The audience realized they weren't watching a man fight, they were watching a man bypass the human nervous system. This demonstration at Long Beach became the catalyst for a paradigm shift in fighting that reverberates to this day. Before those 7 seconds, the prevailing wisdom was that a lighter fighter had to run, evade, and hope to tire out the giant. Lee demonstrated that a lighter fighter could instead generate force that rivaled a heavyweight by perfecting the kinetic chain. He showed that power didn't come from the size of the bicep, but from the synchronization of the entire body. The toes pushing off the ground, the hips rotating with violent torque, the shoulders snapping forward. When he landed the famous 1-inch punch later that same day, sending a man considerably heavier than himself sliding backward across the floor, he was putting an exclamation point on the sentence he had started with the speed demonstration. The psychological impact on the champion and the crowd was devastating. You have to imagine the shattering of ego that occurred in that auditorium. These were men who had dedicated their lives to rigid forms, to the idea that if they held their hand in a specific chambered position, they were safe. Lee dismantled that safety. He showed that a non-classical, fluid approach, one that discarded what was useless and added what was specifically your own, could penetrate the most disciplined defense. The too small insult was revealed to be a projection of insecurity. The Giants weren't afraid of Lee because he was small. They were afraid because he proved that their size offered them no protection against total efficiency. This specific encounter is often overshadowed by Lee's movies, but historians and martial arts experts point to the 1964 Long Beach tournament as the true birth of modern combat sports. It was here that Lee caught the eye of Hollywood producers. Yes, but more importantly, it was here that he proved his theories weren't just philosophy, they were physics. The champion who doubted him walked away with his worldview fractured. He had faced a dragon and realized that scales and claws didn't matter if you couldn't touch the ghost standing in front of you. What makes this story so enduring is not just the physical feat, but the universal human narrative it represents. We are all told at some point that we are too small, too slow, or too inexperienced. We are told to stay in our lane, to respect the hierarchy, to fear the giants. Bruce Lee stood on that mat, surrounded by the old guard, and didn't offer an apology for his existence. He offered a challenge. He didn't try to become a giant, he perfected being himself. He maximized his own attributes until they became weapons that the giants couldn't comprehend. The speed he displayed that day was the result of fanatical, obsessive preparation. Lee was known to watch boxing reels of Muhammad Ali backwards to study footwork. He experimented with electrical muscle stimulation way before it was standard in sports medicine. He ran miles in combat boots. He read anatomy textbooks. 7 seconds of humiliation he delivered to that champion were the tip of an iceberg built on thousands of hours of unseen, lonely torture in his garage. The champion saw a small man. He didn't see the thousands of repetitions that had forged that small man into a weapon of mass destruction. In the aftermath of the demo, silence fell over the Long Beach auditorium. It wasn't the silence of boredom, it was the silence of awe. The kind of silence that happens when you witness something that shouldn't be possible. People began to whisper. The skepticism evaporated, replaced by a desperate need to know how he did it. Bruce Lee had walked in as a curiosity and walked out as a legend. He had taken the biggest insult in the fighting world, "You're too small," and turned it into his greatest asset. His lack of mass allowed for speed. His speed generated power. His power commanded respect. Decades later, modern MMA fighters, boxers, and athletes still study the footage of Lee's movement. They analyze the biomechanics of that day in 1964. They try to replicate the twitch reflex that left a karate champion grasping at thin air. But there is something in the footage that cannot be replicated in a lab. It is the spirit of the man who refused to be defined by the limitations others placed on him. When that champion told him he was too small, he didn't argue. He didn't get angry, he simply demonstrated the truth. The lesson from those 7 seconds in Long Beach is clear. The world will always try to measure you by its own outdated standards. It will try to put you on a scale and tell you what you're worth. But the scale doesn't measure heart, it doesn't measure speed, and it certainly doesn't measure the fire that burns inside a dragon. Bruce Lee proved that if you're fast enough, focused enough, and skilled enough, the giants don't just fall, they never even see you coming.